Hi there and welcome to this week's top grammar tip for cramtheexam.com. This week I'm going to give you a piece of advice, a piece of reassurance. One thing that people are afraid of when they're studying English is conditionals. They get fixated about conditionals. They convince themselves that conditionals are the hardest things in the world, and therefore when they're talking about conditionals, they automatically get some kind of mental block and they think they can't do conditionals, or they avoid conditionals, or conditionals really are terrible, scary things and they should be something to be feared. And then the people start talking about mixed conditionals and they think, oh my god, what the hell is a mixed conditional and how do they work? And what do I do with this? And should I use them? Is it what happens if I get them wrong? And panic. But in actual fact, when I listen to English language learners use conditionals, it is very, very difficult for them to get it wrong because they understand the context in which they are using the conditionals. And most important is that you have to understand the time context in which you use conditionals. You have to understand, and most people do, when it is, which time frame or which time context you use each part of the conditional. So when you're using the first conditional, you have to be aware that you're talking about the present, which somehow relates to the future. When you're talking about the second conditional, you have to be aware that you're using the past to relate to the future, which is why it's called the hypothetical conditional. It's because you're talking about, generally speaking, a hypothetical situation. And then when you're using the third conditional, you have to be aware that you're talking about the past, which is affecting a time later on in the past. So you have to be aware when it is that each conditional has to be used in reference to time. And most people do that automatically. It's never been the case that I've heard someone establish a context of time and use the first conditional to talk about a situation in the past when they really should be using a third conditional. It's simply speaking a mistake that never happens. Where people get caught up is when they think that when they're using a second conditional, they got to use a very strict form and there's no flexibility, and it's got to be past simple plus, and well, you know the rest of the structure, and it can't be anything else. Whereas in actual fact, the conditional structures are incredibly flexible, and us native speakers use them and abuse them in many, many different ways. It is virtually impossible in terms of structure to get a conditional wrong because there are so many exceptions to the rule. So my advice to these people who panic about conditional use is to relax. It's very, very difficult to get a conditional wrong, assuming you've got the context correct. If you're talking about the past, you're going to use past forms. If you're talking about the future, you're going to use future forms. If you're talking about the present, you're going to use present forms. And therefore, conditionals just happen automatically. And because of the flexibility in conditionals, as long as it suits the context of which you're talking, if you're talking about the past connected to the future, or if you're connected about the present talking about the future, or the past talking about the present, or however it is, where you get into the boundaries of mixed conditionals and slightly more complicated forms, and the non-rules, or in other words, using conditionals which are not presented in the textbooks, because the textbooks have to present certain structures, but you're using the full flexibility of the conditional, which is not taught, but you think it's a mistake, but it's not a mistake because it makes sense. Well, you see where I'm going. Conditionals are extremely flexible things, and therefore you shouldn't fear them. Learn the basic structures, yes. If you want to, have a look at click on the links to the videos and to the pages that I've got below this video. Find out really how flexible conditionals are. Find out what you're not taught in the course books, because there's lots of things that you're not taught, and that's for good reason. There's only so much space in a course book. You can't have 300 questions on conditionals. So conditionals is a trial and error thing. And you know when you have got a conditional wrong is that when in conversation you create a time context which isn't quite correct, and then someone looks at you in a slightly funny way. At that point you know what you've said doesn't make that much sense, because otherwise the person wouldn't be confused. But generally when you're using conditionals, as I said, and trust me on this one, it's very, very difficult to get it wrong. Okay, so that was my slightly long-winded way of telling you to relax. when it comes to conditionals. You're going to get it right if you know the basic rules and you know the context in which, the time context in which you're speaking or in which you're writing. So relax, click on the links below, go to the pages, watch the videos, and take it easy.